Okay, welcome everyone to the Columbia Justice Lab series on research and justice policy. And in this speaker series, we're exploring the relationship between research and policy. And we ask each of our speakers to address the theme of how research can help make public policy responsive, how research can help make public policy response to crime more effective in contributing to community safety in a way that's fairer and radically less punitive. We're grateful to have the support of Columbia's Faculty of Arts and Science, and we're very grateful to former Columbia Dean Fred Harris for making this series possible. A couple of notes on format. This is a Zoom webinar and audience members are muted with their videos off. I'm here today at the Columbia Justice Lab with Tracy Meares and a number of our Justice Lab staff and affiliates. And we're reserving time at the end of the hour to respond to audience questions. If you're on Zoom, use the Q&A feature to pose questions at any time throughout the discussion, and our online moderator, Sam, will select the questions to address after the presentation. And Sam, are you there to introduce yourself? There you are.
Hi, I'm Sam Plummer. I'm a postdoc at the Justice Lab, and as Bruce mentioned, I will be moderating the Q&A, so feel free to submit questions at any point during the presentation. Thanks very much.
And of course, we'll also have in-person questions as well. If you have any technical questions, if you're online, feel free to ask those on the Q&A too. Well, we are very lucky today to have Professor Tracy Meares. Tracy is the Walton Hale Hamilton Professor, the founding director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School. Tracy, I would say, is the leading legal scholar of policing in the United States. And her research over many years now has been focused on issues of police legitimacy, the scope of police powers, and the relationship between police and community. Tracy served on President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. She's been a good friend to the Justice Lab, working on Square One's executive session. Most recently, we worked together on the National Academy of Sciences consensus panel study on reducing racial inequality in crime and criminal justice. I've always felt that Tracy's work has done a really masterful job of weaving together legal analysis with social science. I see that as one of the real hallmarks of your work and what makes it so powerful. And over the last decade, I feel that you've been working on this really interesting theme that explores the connections between police, civil society, and democratic institutions. I think a really powerful research agenda. Tracy will be speaking to that theme again today, and her talk is called Uncovering Police. Thanks very much, Tracy.
Thanks, Bruce. Okay, oh good. This will help me figure out where I'm supposed to look. Okay, that's the right one. Great. All right, I'm gonna mostly, I think, so the people who are watching us see this, right?
Yes, this.
Hello, everybody. I am not going to be looking at you while I talk because it seems strange and there are people in the room. So I'm going to be looking at the people in the room. But when we get questions, I'll look at the camera. So, hi. Okay. So this paper is actually not typical for me. As Bruce said, I do a lot of work, like basic social science, social science sort of examining empirically how people in various communities think about police think about their own jobs, how they think about the relationship between those two things. Most recently, from a social psychological perspective, although early in my career, I did work much more in a sociological vein. As Bruce said, lately I've been thinking a lot about conceptions of citizenship. And to think about that, I've done some work in political science. This paper came out of some thinking actually I've been doing for the last decade on the legal basis for thinking about. And what's really interesting about that is that police is not what most people think it is. So you could, when most people think about police, they think about armed emergency first responders. And throughout the paper, you'll see, I call that the policing service. It is an aspect of police, but it is actually a very, very small part of what police is historically. So, okay, I'm going to try to do this PowerPoint thing because I'm a law professor, and unless I'm doing social science-y kinds of presentations, I don't really use PowerPoints. But since you all probably weren't able to read the paper in time, I wanted to have some slides to motivate what I'm talking about. Okay, why did I answer that? Okay. Except no. Okay. All right. Here we go. And I wrote this paper for a journal called Nomos. I don't know if you all know Nomos. Nomos is an interdisciplinary journal that brings together lawyers, legal scholars, philosophers, and political theorists. And it's set up where there is a primary paper in each one of those disciplines. The theme last year was policing. I wrote a law paper, so this is law, get ready. And then there were comments by a philosopher and a political theorist. Then there was a philosophy paper, comments by the other two disciplines, and so on, okay? So what I wanted to do was a paper thinking through the police power. And the first thing to say is that the policing service is not the entirety of police at all, although it is one very small part of it. What police is it is a bunch of topics that are actually central to governance and how the state, in fact, operates. And because of that, it's really central to what I would call the goods of citizenship. So, for example, as I will be talking about, public education and the requirement that people go to school is police. Provision of public health is police. Provision of sanitation is police. The fact that there is clean drinking water and there's state and municipal governance of that is police. And I could go on. And at some point in this talk, I'll give you even more topics of police that you wouldn't necessarily think of as police, but it is central to recognize that that's what it is. However, because it is so incredibly broad and has often been thought of as discretionary, things that the state could do, as opposed to things that the state is obligated to do, it has been lawless, I would say, in critical ways. And I mean that literally descriptively, lawless in the sense that there is no law that says that the state is obligated to provide it. There's not necessarily law that constrains the kinds of topics that police has historically been directed toward. And I will argue later the ways in which that's a problem and suggest a response, which is state constitutional law, I think, could be a mechanism to shape the obligation of police and to constrain its excess. And that's an interesting move for lawyers to make. I don't know. Are there any lawyers in the room? By the way, no. Okay. because historically, the move that lawyers try to make is to go to the federal constitution and talk about the ways in which the 14th Amendment might be a way to limit and constrain police. Federal constitution can never be a source of obligation. And if you went to law school, you know that there is no right to education in the federal constitution. There's no right to have, the policing service, I'll call it, respond in cases where you might think that they should be obligated to respond. That's Castle Rock. There is no obligation to have state social services respond when big children are in danger. The primary case that is Shady versus Winnebago County, which opens the dissent, Justice Blackmun's dissent, begins with the words "poor Joshua." Okay. So, what is police then? Police is actually, and I'm quoting it, it is the state's power to prescribe regulations and to preserve and promote the public safety, health, and morals, and to prohibit all things hurtful to the comfort and welfare of society. Now, I have on the slide a description of Adam Smith's lectures from the 1700s in Glasgow. So this is a topic that goes that far back. And in Europe, it's actually discussed in this way. It is not discussed in this way in the United States. What I find most interesting is Adam Smith's pointing to plenty, the availability of social wealth, which Adam Smith actually thought was critical to dealing with points 1 and 2 and security. That is, we are not actually going to be secure in society unless there is wide availability of social wealth, and that is the point of modern governance. Modern then, says Adam Smith. So how do we think about it in the United States? In the United States, basically, when there is discussion of police, that it's come historically through discussions of the police power, which is a uniquely American term. So just to contrast what happens in Europe, where there's discussion of police. In Europe, there is no discussion of the police power. That's a thing that we do. And the first court case to use the term police power is actually a really interesting one called Alger versus the state of Massachusetts. So what was happening there? Alger owns some land. He builds a dock that goes out into the Boston Harbor. He's actually, he's charged with a crime because there was a law passed by the state of Massachusetts saying that you couldn't actually build anything across the wharf line because, Boston is trying to manage transportation and the Boston Harbor. And Alger argued, well, that's unconstitutional. It's an interference with my right to property. And if the state of Massachusetts is going to do that, then they have to pay me an eminent domain. And here's what the Justice Lemuel Shaw had to say. Rights of property, like all other social and conventional rights, are subject to reasonable limitations of their enjoyment. This is very different from the right of eminent domain, the right of a government to take and appropriate private property whenever the public exigency requires it, which can only be done on condition of providing a reasonable compensation, therefore. The power we allude to, rather, is the police power. The power vested in the legislature to make, ordain, and establish all manner of wholesome and reasonable laws, statutes, ordinances, either with penalties or without, not repugnant to the Constitution, as they shall judge for the good and welfare of the Commonwealth. Now, when this comes out, this opinion comes out, there's language in the opinion that says, well, marking the boundaries of this is really hard. We're not exactly sure how we're gonna define it. But By 1904, there's a scholar at the University of Chicago, Ernst Freud, who wrote the very first treatise on the police power. And I'm going to give you a list of some of the things that are in the police power. It includes safety regulation of mines and railroads, dangerous machinery and fire codes, sanitary regulation of cemeteries, dead bodies, and food are all subjects of the police power. Prohibitions against cruelty to animals, controls of weights and measures, because that's a way of preventing fraud in business, regulation of hours and rates of wages, and regulation of banking. All police. The police power, as I said before, is the basis of compulsory education of children. Now, we're not used to thinking about police and the police power in that way. And I think because we've become really used to thinking about police as almost exclusively people who are armed emergency first providers responding to problems of crime, transgressors of law, we forget and ignore what I'm going to call the critical aspect of police, which focuses on future-oriented risk management and actual social provision, right? Police, it is regulation through prohibition, to be sure, but it's also the basis of public utility and public health. Police is in large part what cities do for and to their citizens. All right, let me give you an example historically of police. This is New York, so your town. There was a Metropolitan Board of Health created in 1866. And what they were trying to do was deal with the cholera epidemics that were breaking out in tenements at the time. They're also trying to deal with the fact that there was a sort of kind of corrupt mayor. Is he in New York or Boston? I can't remember history. Yeah, Mayor Tweed, he was here. And they're trying to deal with the fact that landlords weren't obligated to clean up. People are dying. They didn't really have any sort of governance mechanism to deal with the problem. And there was an idea that nothing could happen to deal with this until something bad happened, and you would deal with it retrospectively. They wanted to have forward-looking ways of addressing it. So there was the health bill that was passed in 1866, and then there was a Metropolitan Board of Health, and it created something that was regional. It covered New York, it covered Brooklyn. It was actually commissioners that were appointed by the governor. It abolished all existing health departments in the city and regionalized this provision. There was a sanitary regional district that included New York's Kings, Westchester, and Richmond counties, the towns of Newton, Flushing, and Jamaica. And most importantly, the health bill declared that it would be the duty of the Metropolitan Police Board, which was also, to advise the Board of Health of all threats to human life or health, as well as to enforce and execute sanitary regulations. But they were only enforced and executed at the direction of the Board of Health and not the other way around. Okay? So, for example, at the time, the police, the Metropolitan Police were the street sweepers. They cleaned the streets to deal with problems of sanitation. And they also did things like submit weekly reports of instances in which streets, wharves, and piers hadn't been cleaned. They made lists of cesspools and cisterns still in use. A lot of, for these slaughterhouses, a lot of sort of health regulatory kinds of things. Now, I think what I find interesting about this example is that it's an agency that might be familiar to us, intermingling what we would consider to be modern policing tasks with those that we don't necessarily consider to be modern policing. You know, the like looking at what cesspools are doing and street cleaning and so on. You might think, well, this is actually police officers at the direction of the Board of Health doing things that we are thinking in terms of forward-looking safety provision. On the other hand, you know, those kinds of, you know, marking what the cesspool looks like and, you know, lack of sanitation might also be painfully familiar and, you know, echoing the report on Ferguson, Missouri. The point, though, historically, is that all of these tasks were discussed in parlance of police in order to make the city work in a very forward-looking way. It was not trying to address problems retrospectively and just punish people, right? Now, here's the real issue, though. I mean, you know, I gave you the big, long list of things that one could consider police. And I hope, once you see that list, that the potentially problematic nature of it is immediately obvious. You know, I rely a lot on historian Bill Novak's work, where he shows, look, the early history of these regulatory forms was designed to promote the general welfare in the face of rapacious capitalism. That is true. And police and the police power was a key way legally to justify the development of the New Deal era. That's his argument. And I think he tells it pretty convincingly. And I think the success of that is so complete that we now take for granted a lot of the administration that now structures our lives that was not obviously going to happen at the time at all, okay? However, it is also true that those same regulatory forms were used to suppress, exclude, and discriminate. And it's still used, right? And this duality, I think, is a function of the fact that during the building of the modern state, as I was just describing, you know, the capacious and ambiguous nature of the state's police power grew in relationship to very weak national power, right? So this is happening in the late 1800s. You know, so we're thinking like just after Reconstruction. A lot of what we think of as 14th Amendment jurisprudence didn't exist. There was no sort of robust definition of any other federal rights, you know, before the 14th Amendment. And before the 14th Amendment actually made national citizenship formally clear, states were entitled to choose who was and who wasn't a citizen. And the law of citizenship, that's police, right? Until the 14th Amendment changed it. There's really great work on that by Kate Meares in her recent book, Until Justice Be Done, talking about how during the antebellum period, states used police through definitions of citizenship to exclude free Black people from what I call in the paper, the burgeoning welfare goods that are being created, like education and so on. And I call it welfare goods, building from my colleague and co-author Ben Justice's work. Another paper I recommend to you, where he calls schooling a white good. And the construction of that, as opposed to a public good, the construction of something as a white good as opposed to a public good is, I would argue, a function of the way that police was used to distribute, exclude, discriminate, and so on. So also, what other kinds of things are police? Laws concerning public morals, vagrancy, eugenics, all that's police too. All right. Now, given that complicated history, you might think, well, it's odd for me to look at police as a project of a potential progressive transformation. And let me tell you why. There's at least two reasons why. First, history already shows us that a version of the kind of policing that many people are advocated for, people not being armed, engaged in a kind of, if there is emergency response, it's emergency response to people who are in mental and emotional distress, and you have people who are trained for that and so on. We've done that 1866, right? It exists, that model. And I think once you see that history shows us that a version of this already exists, it destabilizes, I would argue, contemporary expectations about the nature of what the policing service inevitably must be. Second, I think, the very breadth and discretionary nature of potential police projects, I think, makes clear that nothing about the contemporary policing service as we know it today is foreordained or required, as some people have argued, right? Nothing about it, right? And I think because we've lost the history of the connection between police, capital P, every time I say police as opposed to policing, I police the stuff I'm talking about, capital P, and municipal governance, we've actually come to identify the term with these particular armed emergency providers and not the entire project of governance. And why do I think that is important? Because lawyers, I think, can play a role here. What can they do? Well, one thing we can do is talk about legal mandates. So my friend, the lawyer across the table, knows that when we talk about the federal constitution, we talk a lot about rights, right? Well, state constitutions have rights too. And here are some of them. You have a right to education. Every state constitution in our country articulates this as such. Many constitutions actually articulate rights around labor. Many of those were passed during the progressive era, which is the era that that Novak is focusing on in his book. Housing, the Constitution of this state that we are sitting in actually has a constitutional right to shelter. There are many states that actually have a stated right to a clean environment. And if you're following that issue, there is currently litigation going on right now in Montana that has an articulated right to a clean environment where the plaintiffs asserting that right have actually won a case against the state of Montana, granted a license, I think it was for oil drilling. And the court said, yeah, there is this right here. And so this requires you to undergo certain processes before you just pass this license willy-nilly. So what does it mean to put something in a state constitution, a constitutional amendment? This is the part of the paper that gets really la. So I'm going to talk less about it. And, maybe you can ask me some particular questions that, will motivate non-lawyers' understanding of what I'm trying to do. Also, at this point, I think you should have the paper in it. It will probably explain things. I tried to write it in a way that was pretty accessible. But we know from work that political scientists have done. I'm relying here a lot on the work of Emily Zakin at Johns Hopkins, and also political scientist Alan Tarr, who's at Rutgers. They've shown actually that amendments to state constitutions do things that are very helpful to the project, because almost every project of transformation, focuses on some kind of policy. We're very, excited when cities pass laws where they say, we're not going to use armed police, for example, to engage in traffic service. Okay. The point about doing this in a state constitution is that can actually be articulated at the state level, and you don't have to actually do it agency by agency, city by city, and so on. Okay. So we know that
amendments to state constitution do a few things. They help to advance political organizing. So if any of you have actually studied social movements and sociology, we know that the constitutional amendment process advances that. And many people have done that work. And another really interesting and important thing that state constitutional amendments do is that they can exclude hostile courts from policy battles. Now, we're not used to thinking about amendments doing that if you focus on the federal constitution, because we think about right as being something that an individual uses to, as a bulwark against the power of the state. What's happening in state constitutions is something different. The history of state constitutional amendments expresses much more of a concern about the ways in which legislatures, courts, and other state governance institutions have been captured by elites. And so it's much more of a majoritarian politics process than the way it works in federal constitutional processes, which can have costs. And we can talk about ways in which that can have costs, but it does do something really important if, for example, we think, might not exactly work, but if you think that qualified immunity is a problem, right? That the courts are the ones who are managing that, and this approach can say, okay, we're done with you doing that. We're not doing that anymore, kind of thing. And I think third and most importantly, it creates obligations to motivate state legislatures to pursue targeted legislation on the topic. So almost anything I would want to do here, including the Metropolitan Health Bill, that didn't happen in the state constitutional amendment. It was legislation. So you might be asking me, well, why wouldn't we just do state legislation? I'd be like, yeah, great, let's do it. It can be costly, it can be hard to do, it can be harder to do than this, for reasons that I can get into. But one of the things that I find, again, incredibly fascinating about this idea is that many states actually have a required constitutional convention on a regular cadence that no one ever uses, right? And so rather than talk about state ballot initiatives and so on, if you're paying attention, for example, the fact that Connecticut has a mandatory state convention in the next 5 years, which it does, you can imagine that kind of organizing now. You don't have to pay for it. It's already on docket. And then you just direct that conversation towards this issue. I mean, I made it sound a lot easier than it probably is. The real point here is that there are many options legally to advance this project that we are not using. And I think this one is interesting, both practically, but also in terms of civic education, right? State constitutions matter. If you look at them deductively, they actually explain to a polity, what its priorities are for, what we stand for. And people often will have in the past looked to the federal constitution in that way, but I would argue that a state constitution is a much more direct, particularized, and forward-looking way to do it, because we are constantly and have constantly historically looked at our state constitutions. We've not only amended them, we've actually replaced them. So unlike the federal constitution, if you look at the state constitutions, they've been amended thousands of times and replaced hundreds of times. And I think it is a place where we can direct intellectual and political energy toward this project. So that's what I've got, and we'd love to have your questions.
Before we go online, why don't we we'll open the floor to everyone, but also in the room. Questions for Tracy? Sarah.
Hey, I'm a lawyer.
I've been a lawyer for 2 weeks, so I just want to clarify. But it was the first time I got to raise my hand, so it felt great. This was fascinating. I have a lot to think about. I was wondering if you could talk about two other historical trends and kind of place them in your history. One is militarization of police, and obviously that feeds into how the image of the police of today has become so concrete as this armed enforcer. And the second is like these waves of deregulation and the fight against the administrative state and the privatization of public services. So I'm just curious if just really broadly, can you talk about how those trends fit into the history?
Let me do the second. In part because I thought more about that. And I think it much more clearly fits in with the theme here. So if you look at Novak's work, he's written 2 books. The names of them. One of them is looks at all of these regulations from very early on. That wasn't the one that I was talking about. It's called the People's Welfare Law and Regulation in the 19th Century. And then the second book is called, I was just thinking of Novak's book. The second one is called The New Democracy, the Creation of the Modern American State. And his project in these 2 books has been to use history to tell a story that this idea of like a commitment to the free market and deregulation is just wrong. It's not sort of the natural state of how the state was formed at all. So that's the story, right? That regulation is rare, it's exceptional, celebration of property rights, and he's just like, no, and you read these books and he's got lists and lists and lists of regulation. And then the story is often told is that, well, that's against a background of the usual thing is that you get to do whatever. And he's like, yeah, no, like you can't actually read the history and believe that. So part of this is inserted into that into that story. And the thing I would offer on militarization of police, maybe 2 things. That is that if you look at policing agencies, agencies of policing service, the ways in which they've been allowed to grow up is, where police carry guns, and in contrast to policing services in Europe, for example, where there is a very robust discussion of police and police science, that's what it's called. And by police science, again, I am not talking about the science of the policing service. I'm talking about police, capital P. You can see that the policing service has been largely lawless, as I said. I mean, really interesting examples of that. So, almost every city, well, in fact, that's not true. A lot of cities have charters, which you might call the constitution of the city. And so given that, you would think, well, every city should have a charter. Again, Europe, right? A lot of cities, even that are allowed, have been explicitly authorized by their state to have a charter. No, there's only like 6 states that don't have that kind of authorization, which means that the state itself is actually in charge of all the rules, which is actually good for my argument. But in that world, you would think, okay, you're going to have a charter, and also the key agencies within a city would actually be articulated in a charter, and you would say exactly what those agencies should do and shouldn't do. If you look at your state constitution or state legislation, you'll see that like there's a Department of Education for the state, and there's legislation that says this is established and this is what it should do and this is what it shouldn't do, and so on, right? Why would we have that why would we not have that at the municipal level for an agency that has so much power over our lives? That's what I mean when I say it's lawless, right? And so what that means, I think, is that these agencies have been allowed to grow up, through informal agreements, through practice, through habit, through, against the background, as I said before, of lack of a robust national power, against laws where it was really important to states and municipalities at certain points in history to exclude people. It's always been much more important to exclude than it has been to provide. So that's the way I would think about it in relationship to the militarization. And to my mind, that creates a demand for this, what I call in the paper, an obligation of non-harmful safety provision. And, we can actually think about a constitutional right of a state constitutional right of non-harmful safety provision, where safety comprises things that people require to be safe, which would include, for example, how we think about public utilities, and how do you, especially in light of the fact that we know that police it comprises sanitation, cleanliness, and so on. In the midst of the COVID pandemic, for example, how could you feel safe if you don't have clean water to wash your hands, right? That's safety. And so I think this is a process of helping people to have a much more expansive way of thinking about safety, but also to much more clearly articulate the state's obligation to do it. That it's not just something that the state could do, but it is something that the state is obligated to do.
Can I jump in, Tracy, and sort of follow up on your response to Sarah's question? So this is super provocative in a number of ways, right? You and I were just on a consensus panel study for NAS, and we were tracing the history of police to slave patrols and the
policing service.
The policing service, right? And I think in contemporary conversations, that's how the policing service is often understood now. And you're sort of excavating a different kind of history of policing in which there's been enormous progressive potential. Makes me think that we're really talking about two distinct kinds of state power.
Yes.
One is sort of quite coercive in defense of the powerful, and the police service is pressed into the defense of slavery, and was on the front lines in many cases, defending Jim Crow and opposing the expansion of civil rights. That's one kind of state power. And then there's this other kind of state power that we can find also lots of examples of historically, which is, I think of as fundamentally redistributive and sort of great chapters of social progress, and public sanitation had huge benefits for life expectancy in American history, and public schooling over time became more widely distributed. The gap in educational attainment between blacks and whites gradually shrunk over. So that's a progressive example. The other thing I hear you saying is that state constitutions can be a tremendously important arena for progressive social policy. And we could mount campaigns around progressive social change by focusing on state constitutions.
That's the argument.
And I think that is terrific. Here's my question. I hear you to be arguing that there's some additional analytical leverage in us thinking about that as a police power.
Yes, I do.
And,
Make that.
and so I'm trying to pin that down.
Yeah.
Like, why can't we just think about social services, redistribution,
Yeah,
provision
so
of public goods?
here's what I think. Here's my intuition. My intuition is that despite the fact that the policing service has long been essentially lawless, people think of it as an obligation. That there are people who will argue, as I said before, that the shape of the policing service must take a particular form. Like, police cannot not be armed, or so on. And this is what they can do, and it's the only thing they can do. And so one reason I have for making this argument is a little bit of rhetorical jujitsu, which is to say, no, it's police, and actually it was never foreordained. You have to show me where it was. And my history is actually better than yours in terms of the legal basis for it. So a little bit of that. Second, I think once you really kind of understand, this is rhetorical jujitsu point two, that all of these things are about police, I actually think it can elevate the kinds of things that, people like you and me and probably everybody in the room cares about, right? Police. And so that, I feel like it could potentially, it's a way of pushing back. Like, it's as much of an obligation if you think that that's an obligation. It's like, this part's an obligation, and this is public safety, and this is what people think is required for public safety. So, something like that. But also, from a legal standpoint, so this is not the rhetorical, if you're going to do it, if you're going to do the things that we are talking about that's necessary to do, police power is the legal basis for doing it. So you can't, just as a legal matter, so maybe this is an argument that lawyers have. You can't just say, oh yeah, well, it's something we could do kind of maybe when we feel like it until we don't feel like doing it. It's like, no, this is actually literally your reason for being here. Municipality, state, it is. This is what you are here to do. And, I've got some really interesting stuff on Jane Addams in the paper, where, if you look at the modern formation of city governance, this is what they did. This is what it was. It wasn't sort of making sure that people could have guns and go bring people. I mean, that was part of it. But, cholera was killing way more people, right? That's what they were doing. Getting water, clean water was what they were doing. All of those things. And we're in that moment too, right? So I think those are the reasons for thinking about that. But, I suppose you could just, you don't have to. I write at the beginning, the work I will do in this essay sits somewhere between a meditation and a provocation. People are more likely to read it if I say it this way, Bruce.
Yeah, super. I mean, and it also.
And it's just true. I mean, from a legal standpoint.
It elevates the progressive moment for which citizenship is.
Correct.
Sam?
Yes,
Oh,
hi.
over there.
Okay.
Sorry. So we also just had a few people in the chat asking if you might be able to speak a bit louder, just because I
We'll
think.
try.
Okay. A question from Benjamin Justice, setting aside the outright fascist wing of the Republican Party, are there things about this way of thinking about the police power that might be appealing to legal and ideological conservatives?
Seriously, you're asking me a question. So I don't know if it's appealing to them as much as I think it's a version of the answer I gave to Bruce, which is it's designed to undermine the particular arguments that they want to make about this is the only shape that the policing service can take. This is the only thing that state and municipalities can do. So it's much more designed to weaken their arguments than to appeal to them. There is another reason, Bruce, you just reminded me for why I want to talk about it in this way is I personally find arguments that people make about in terms of non-harmful safety provision, I find it not great, potentially dangerous to say that this is something that a community can do on its own. I understand why people make that argument, but the reason for talking about it in the context of the police power and state constitutional amendment is to make clear that I think it is an obligation of the state to provide these welfare goods and not simply enable people to scrape by in the best way that they can. And Justice, no, I do not think that people on the right would love that part of the argument, but you know.
Another question from Adam Kluge. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing the last name. How can contemporary conversations around the policing of protest be understood against the broader context of policing power? Is this a means of preserving / maintaining public safety or an excessive use of state power?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on how that's carried out. I mean, anytime you have a lot of people in a place, there are people who will potentially get hurt in a crowd. It depends on how they're doing it. But I don't think anything about my argument is inconsistent with, in fact, it can't be, allowing people to express First Amendment rights and so on. I don't really see how this argument makes it more difficult for people to do that. In fact, the opposite. And since it would be about non-harmful safety provision, I would argue that it imposes an obligation on a police service to the extent that exists. And when I say police service, I'm using some version of the contemporary police service, which you're going to have some version of that managing crowds and so on. And they would have to do it in a way that was non-harmful. I mean, this argument really isn't about necessarily the particularities of specific policy. It's much more about expanding the purview of what the state's obligation is to provide, safety goods that go well beyond armed emergency first responders.
I was having a conversation with a voting rights advocate last week, and we were talking about policing protest, about the police role in protecting First Amendment rights, and I was thinking in that conversation, if police service function was organised much more deliberately about protecting political voice and sort of sustaining citizenship in that way, it would look
very different.
radically different.
Let me just say too, just a couple of things, again, for the people who are the non-lawyers in the room. This idea of moving to state constitutions also is a way of, and maybe this is also an answer to your question, Bruce. The federal constitution in this country is actually exceptional in the way that it's designed, and that it has no what you would call positive rights. Almost every constitution across the globe has positive constitutional rights. So in that sense, state constitutions look more like everybody else's constitution, right? The exception is the federal constitution, not the other way around. And so once you understand that too, then you can see, well, we had modes of, observing, enforcing, attending to, holding states, and by states now I mean nations, accountable for adhering to those positive constitutional rights. That's what human rights law does. There are these, they have these indexes, the political science is like rife with work around that. So the way I'm imagining, which I'm not going to write in this paper because I only get 8,000 words and I'm already at 8,200, but you can imagine you have a right to non-harmful. There's going to be conventions that discuss all the kinds of things that people care about, which the interpretation of that right is going to rely upon. You can actually create indexes to sort of see the ways in which people are adhering to it or not. Lots of constitutions, for example, have a right to clean water. And there's really interesting political science on how you measure the extent to which that state is actually providing clean water for its citizens. So I'm imagining a really interesting model where we actually look to international law as a way of measuring the adherence to something like this, at the state level. And importantly, just bypassing the federal constitution. I mean, it is what it is, it's there, okay. It's always been limited. And I don't think that we've really plumbed the value of the fact that, states can do a whole lot. They really can. We just haven't really focused on it for all sorts of reasons historically, and I think that's fine. So now it's time to use what we have.
Sam, do you have another at your end?
We have several questions that are addressing, I guess, the potential problems with expanding our sense of the police to include, I think, what maybe are typically construed as welfare state functions. And wondering if you might be able to speak to that. So thinking about calls for kind of turning police into mental health first responders. And that's of course, a more narrow understanding of the police service, but I think the questions are more broadly getting at what are the challenges of expanding this definition.
I would say that I really want people to listen to what I'm saying. I'm not talking about expanding. Police is what it is. I mean, whether you want to accept it or not, I'm not making it up, right? That's what it is, okay? The police service is a thing that can be done under police. So I'm not expanding anything. Police is what it is. And nothing about the argument entails necessarily expanding the policing service to do any of these things. It's all about creating an obligation on the part of the state to do it. They call it whatever you want, and you can call the agents whatever you want. I'm just saying, as a legal matter, it is police. And so I think part of
what's happening when people are listening to this is that they're falling into the trap of thinking that the policing service is police. And it is a part of police, but it is not and has never been the whole entirety of police. It's just not. That's all I got.
Sam, we're right on time. You
Okay.
want to come in quickly?
Okay, it's kind of an extension of that, and I hope I'm not falling into the same trap that everyone else falls. My understanding of your argument is that you create some, that ideally you'd have some bounds around police, and then police service might be part of those bounds, giving police service like laws, and then maybe kind of limiting the kind of forever expanding responsibilities of the police service. So that like, we say this is what we define the police service, and we define the other kind of areas of police.
Yeah.
And so when a new issue comes up, maybe because the police have been defined in such a way that it can't absorb this new issue, like what do you imagine happens? Like where's the like right now police service seems to be a catch-all for a lot of
Yeah. And I would say because it's the catch-all, it necessarily constrains and shapes
Sure.
what police, it's always emergency.
Right.
It's always the people with on, I am saying three things. I will do it in reverse order. Having a constitutional amendment saying that there is a right to non-harmful safety provision creates an obligation on the part of the state to provide non-harmful safety provision. That could include and entail, for example, creating a state agency of non-harmful safety provision that does all kinds of things, right? And one small part of that might be making sure that whatever the existing use of armed emergency first responders looks like X. But importantly, it's going to be, people have to have clean water, and maybe we're going to think about housing differently, and so on, right? But the right way I would say to reason about it is not about so much limiting, coming from the inside of the existing policing service and, thinking about its constraint and what it can do. Although I do think this approach does entail that. But the right way is to say, there is this obligation. Like imagine what it would look like before there was an obligation to provide schools, right? Like there are lots of ways to think about how to set up schooling, and there's a long history of how that happened. And Ben Justice, who asked me that question, has written a lot about that, right? And so, when you start thinking about, I don't know, this is not my area, but like a right to adequate education, for example, you wouldn't necessarily think that the way we're going to make sure that education is adequate is to like take our existing schools and do a bunch of things differently. It could, but that wouldn't necessarily be the only way to do it.
Right.
Right.
Well, I was just kind of asking that because I see where Ben like providing this like kind of codified right to safety does seem like it might appeal to like you might be able to build kind of cross
Maybe.
style coalitions versus something maybe not.
Well, I mean, we are over time, in fact, and Tracy, I think you've succeeded spectacularly in providing both an invitation and a topic. So please join me in thanking Tracy. Thank you all for joining. Thank you all for joining online. Our next talk will be on December 11th, and we will have Monica Bell, also from Yale Law. So we're getting a good dose of wireless this semester. Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.